China has a terrible reputation on human rights, and with good reason. For decades, they've enforced a brutal one-child policy. Today, you'll hear Zhang Min's first-hand account of being forced to endure not one, but 3 abortions at the cruel hand of the Communist Chinese government. And population expert Stephen Mosher will share how it's adversely affecting this nation. Stay with us. Stephen Mosher is president of the Population Research Institute, a nonprofit group established to expose the myth of overpopulation. In 1979, Stephen was the first American social scientist to visit mainland China. While there, he witnessed the atrocities of the then new one-child policy.
I was in China when it first opened its doors to the West back in 1979, and when the one-child policy began, I went to my neighbors and asked them what was happening, and they said, well, women are being arrested. Our women are being arrested for the crime of being pregnant. And they were surprised by this because, after all, it had been legal to have a second, third, and fourth child up until that point, and now all of a sudden the government was declaring no third children, no fourth children under any circumstances. Most people are going to be limited to 1 child, and if you happen to be pregnant with a second child, you must have an abortion.
Now, what was the purpose behind all of this?
It was to supposedly combat China's population problem. Now, I say supposedly because under the late Chairman Mao Zedong, China thought that its population was a great natural resource, and they were encouraging people to have larger families. But all of a sudden, when population control began to gain traction in the West, in the United States, in 1970, and then we had the Great Club of Rome report in 1974, which said that unless the world controls its population, there's going to be an economic, ecological, and environmental catastrophe in years to come. The Chinese leadership got a hold of a copy of that Club of Rome report. They thought it was the best and brightest of American science, Western science, and they sought to apply it to China. So the one-child policy was basically made in the West by the radical environmental movement.
Reggie Littlejohn is the president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, an international coalition to oppose forced abortion and sexual slavery in China. A graduate of Yale Law School, Reggie has represented Chinese refugees in political asylum cases in the U.S. As a result, she's heard first-hand accounts of the brutality of the one-child policy.
So we're coming up now on the 30th anniversary of the one-child policy. And what people don't realize is that this is not voluntary at all. It is enforced through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and infanticide.
The policy's been described as a very brutal one. Can you give me some specifics of how China enforces this?
In November of 2009, there was a congressional hearing in which there are a dozen expert reports that were generated about this enforcement. In one of my reports, I presented evidence of new cases of coercion. In 2 of those instances, the women who were victims of forced abortion died themselves. These forced abortions can occur up to the 9th month of pregnancy.
The first stage in the process was identifying all the women who were pregnant with illegal children. And they did that by doing a house-to-house survey. They would then order them, if they were pregnant with a second child too soon or a third or fourth child, they would order them to attend local study sessions. There they would be locked up in small rooms, not let out, incarcerated, until they submitted to an abortion. Their meals would be brought to them. They'd get 2 meals of simple rice gruel every day. They would be harangued from morning to night by senior Communist Party officials about the need for them to have an abortion. And finally, after days or weeks, or in some cases months of incarceration, these women, their will broken, would finally be taken in under escort to the local medical clinic, where they would then be given an abortion.
What if they refused to submit to the abortion? That don't happen.
At the time they went into labor, they were taken by force and their babies were killed at birth by the process of lethal injection.
In a moment, you'll hear the testimony of Zhang Min, a woman whose life was tragically impacted by China's brutal one-child policy.
Look around you. We're surrounded by people who courageously face difficult obstacles life has thrown in their paths. Tune in each week to meet people who show there are positive, godly solutions to tough, critical situations. This Emmy Award-winning show tackles challenging life issues such as abortion, stem cell research, and adoption, and shows every human life is valuable and precious. Join us for inspiring stories of people facing life head on.
Zhang Min is one of few women who've been willing to publicly share her testimony of coerced abortion in China. Zhang, along with her husband, currently reside in America. While living in China, she was a reporter for the Chinese media company. I had the opportunity to sit down with Zhang Min to hear her powerful story of how China's one-child policy has affected her life. Zhang, please tell me about your story about the 3 abortions that were forced upon you when you were in China.
I was born in 1950s. My story is a typical story for a woman who was born in the 1950s in China. I had my first child in 1978. I had 3 abortions in 1981, 1984, and 1988. When my son was 5 or 6 months old, I learned I would never be able to have another child. In the city, the government ruled that if you have another child, you would lose your job. At that time, China has a planned economy. Jobs are very important to everyone. So this policy became a strong control mechanism to reduce the country's birth. Even if you were able to have another child, you would never be able to obtain an ID for him or her. He or she would never have rice tickets, clothing tickets, or other basic living necessities. Your child would never be able to go to elementary school, middle school, high school, not mentioning college. So they make it practically impossible to have another child. When a woman learns she's pregnant, the first thing she would do is to go get an abortion. In the villages, many women were physically pulled and dragged onto the operation table. At that time, China did use anesthesia for abortion. It was a very painful experience. When a woman learned that she was pregnant, it was almost like a disaster fall on her. I was always scared of getting pregnant. I had so much grief for my abortion. I could not blame the country. I could not blame the society, so I blamed my husband. That has affected our marriage. My experience of getting abortion has turned our marriage from something beautiful into distress. Every time I see a child, I think about the children I lost. If I have not had abortion, I would have a 32-year-old, a 29-year-old, a 26-year-old, and a 22-year-old. My child would have brothers and sisters. A baby in a mother's womb is a life. No one should be able to deprive that life.
When we return, you'll hear how the continuation of China's one-child policy could prove disastrous in the future.
Whether you're a student needing answers, a parent needing help, or a concerned citizen wanting to make a difference, Life Issues Institute has the resources you need to put your values into action. Life Issues Institute is an international educational organization committed to protecting innocent human life. Life Issues Institute knows what it takes. That's why millions throughout the world turn here for help. Life Issues Institute has authored more pro-life publications than any other entity in the world, and its materials are printed in over 30 languages. Radio broadcasts, newsletters, and a website filled to the brim with the answers you're looking for are just a click away. Go to facinglife.tv and click on the link to Life Issues Institute to find out more about how you can change the heart of a nation.
Since the institution of its brutal one-child policy, China has seen a big change in its population's demographic, especially when it comes to gender. The situation has become extremely dire for little baby girls. Now, I've been reading about the term gendercide as it relates to all of this. Could you explain to our viewers just what that means?
Well, gendercide is the selective elimination by abortion of one particular gender. Gendercide isn't sex-specific, the term itself is not, but it does refer almost invariably to the elimination of little baby girls. Certainly in the Asian context, in Confucian, patriarchal, patrilineal cultures like you find in China, in Japan, in Korea, in Vietnam, the little children, the little unborn children who are eliminated are almost invariably girls. Boys are treasured, girls are not. And so in China today, you find tens of millions of young men who will not be able to get married because their brides have been eliminated by sex-selective abortion, gendercide.
Now, in China in general, according to a 2005 mini census, there are approximately 120 boys born for every 100 girls born. However, in areas of China, for example, in the countryside where you're allowed to have a second child if your first child is a girl, among second children, the sex ratio is even more skewed. In fact, there are 9 provinces in which the sex ratio for that was 160 boys born for every 100 girls born. It's because of the traditional preference for boys and the availability of amniocentesis and the harsh limit on birth where the sex of the child becomes all the more important. So that in turn has led to a situation of human trafficking.
What type of human trafficking are we talking about?
We're talking about sexual slavery and forced marriage. Because there are an estimated 37 million more men than women in China today, that sex ratio imbalance is the driving force behind human trafficking and sexual slavery, not only in China, but in several of the surrounding countries where women and girls are being trafficked into China for sexual slavery, forced marriage.
With all of the violence and harm befallen women as a result of China's one-child policy, it'd be logical to see self-proclaimed pro-choice women's groups coming to their aid. Obviously, forced abortion in China is not a choice for any of the women affected, but tragically, the cries of China's women have gone unnoticed by pro-choice advocates. Now, the so-called pro-choice movement is under the banner of it's my choice to have an abortion, and it's my choice only. Surely the pro-abortion, pro-choice people, the crowd, must be clamoring against this one-child policy in China, wouldn't they? Because it's forcing women to have abortions?
You might think so. But in fact, and that was my thought when I first came back from China in the early 80s. I thought, I will go to the National Organization of Women and the National Abortion Rights Action League, and I will tell them what's being done to their sisters in China, and they will be horrified, and they will join me in speaking out against this atrocity of forcing women who are carrying wanted children to have abortions and sterilizations. So I actually went to see them. And I will never forget what the head of the National Organization of Women told me after I showed her my photographs and recounted my testimony, as I've told you here today. She thought for a second and said, well, I'm personally opposed to forced abortion. But after all, China does have a population problem. And that's the answer I heard from the left, from the so-called pro-choice movement over and over again. So these people are not pro-choice at all. These people reveal themselves to me to be pro-abortion and pro-population control because of the myth of overpopulation.
Pro-choice organizations are a little bit worried about saying anything that opposes abortion, even if it's forced abortion. And they need to be made more comfortable that what this is China's one-child policy causes more violence towards women and girls than any other official policy in the history of the world and any other official policy on the face of the earth. It is an instrument of violence against women and girls. And if it's approached that way, then I don't see any alternative from these women's rights organizations opposing the coercive enforcement of this policy.
In spite of the countless violent actions taken and resultant tragedies, China believes its one-child policy has been a success. But what their government fails to see or acknowledge is how its impact on the future of China's economy and demographic may very well prove disastrous.
China brags it has eliminated by means of forced abortion, forced sterilization, and forced contraception 400 million Chinese from the population. They say this is a great thing, and I say that eliminating 400 million of the most productive, energetic, and enterprising people the world has ever known is not necessarily a good thing for your country. China would be wealthier today. The environment would be better protected by means of that wealth if those people had been allowed to live and hadn't been forced to die. They've set up a huge demographic trap for themselves that they are now falling into, the trap of an aging and dying population. China's population will begin to decline in the next few years, but even before that happens, even before the absolute numbers begin to fall, we're seeing the most rapid aging of China's population that we've ever seen in any population in human history. There are more and more Chinese in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and fewer young Chinese, and that becomes over time unsustainable.
So, Steve, what would you say the answer to all of this is to reverse this cruel one-child policy?
Well, the China must, as soon as possible, abandon the one-child policy and allow Chinese couples to enjoy one of the first freedoms, that is the freedom to decide for yourselves the number and spacing of your children. If they don't do this, they are setting themselves up for a long-term demographic and economic collapse.
Coming up, you'll hear how Americans and women like Zhang Min can make a difference by speaking out against China's inhumane one-child policy.
Look around you. Every day, heroes abound in our country. We're surrounded by people who courageously face difficult obstacles life has thrown in their paths. Tune in each week to meet people who show there are positive, godly solutions to tough, critical situations. We'll tackle challenging life issues such as abortion, stem cell research, adoption, and abstinence, and show that every human life is valuable and precious. Join us for inspiring stories of people facing life head-on.
It's been 30 years since China enacted its one-child policy, and to commemorate the anniversary, the Chinese government announced plans to continue this brutal family planning policy for decades to come. But this isn't just a Chinese issue. It becomes an American issue since U.S. tax dollars are being used to fund this inhumane activity. Now, there are those who say this is an internal child policy for China. We Americans and other countries shouldn't interfere in their policies. So why should we not follow that advice?
Well, we shouldn't follow that advice because we are funding organizations that in turn are funneling some of that money into China. The same year I went into China the first time in 1979, two organizations that we know well, the International Planned Parenthood Federation and the UN Population Fund, also went into China with generous programs in support of the one-child policy. UNFPA pumped $50 million into China. The IPPF's contribution was several million dollars. So they became cheerleaders and financial supporters of China's one-child policy using our tax dollars.
So you're saying we as taxpayers are funding forced abortion in China?
We as taxpayers are indirectly funding forced abortion in China.
Well, what can the average American do who opposes this type of activity.
And they need to contact their elected officials and tell them no more money for population control, no more money for the UN Population Fund, no more money for Planned Parenthood.
The number one thing that people can do is educate themselves. So I would ask people not only to watch this show, but to go on my website and go on to the congressional testimony page and read some of the testimony and the documentation of these practices, because the stuff that's happening is horrific beyond anyone's imagination. A woman's womb is the most intimate part of her, spiritually, physically, emotionally. And for the Chinese Communist Party to come in and say, I have life or death power over your womb, is something that is shattering for the women of China. And people within China really cannot speak out against this because we have freedom of speech. I think those of us who are able to speak up against this have a moral obligation to do so.
Finding a woman like Zhang Min to share her story is a rare occurrence. Many Chinese women are afraid to tell their stories for fear of their family's safety, most of whom are still in China. Zhang and her family were exiled from China nearly 2 decades